Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Who's up and who's down after the first debate of most Republican presidential candidates? And can any of them compete with Donald Trump? Let's get to the bottom line. The Republican agenda was on full display this week as the party tries to take back the White House in next year's election. In the first debate of the season, 8 candidates argued about religion, about abortion, about support for Ukraine, how to fix the American education system, and how to deal with the rise of China. Former President Donald Trump is so far ahead in opinion polls that he decided to just skip it. He talked to former Fox News host Tucker Carlson in a sprawling interview instead. Now the question for Republicans is, can they convince a majority of the American people, not just the folks in their own party, to buy into their ideas or at least turn their backs on President Joe Biden and the Democrats next year? And do these debates even matter? Today, we're talking with Rodney Davis, former Republican congressman from Illinois and now the managing director of Cozen O'Connor, a lobbying firm in Washington, D.C., and Shelby Talcott, politics reporter for Semafor, where, in full disclosure, I also work. Thank you both for joining us. You were in Congress. I mean, you've been in these debates before. And as you looked at the party that I think you still belong to, but that you served as a representative of, did you see any positive sprigs from the conversations held last night?
Let's be serious. This debate last night was like going to a 1980s era professional wrestling match and having Ric Flair cancel on his match the day before the event. You know, Donald Trump is the Ric Flair of this professional wrestling type presidential campaign for the Republican nomination right now, and everybody else was part of the undercard. And unfortunately, because I certainly want one of these candidates to be our nominee, unfortunately, I don't think one of them stepped up to really truly claim that second place mantle so that they could get the rest of America to rally around them.
You know, when you think about other elements of this debate where there were policy differences, I was intrigued that there were real differences on abortion, for instance. And you had Nikki Haley chastising Mike Pence, the former vice president, for advocating and standing and posturing a policy that she said would never pass. I'd like to hear from both of you what you thought were the more meaningful policy differences between some of the candidates that may be educating those people watching, and that might be a net positive out of this. Rodney?
I don't know if...
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Shelby.
I don't know if abortion was a net positive for the Republican candidates on stage. I think it actually just served as reinforcement in the idea that the Republican Party has struggled on the issue of abortion since Roe. The one topic I thought was pretty enlightening was Ukraine, and this is where we saw a wide variety of people. We saw Mike Pence take kind of the old school, the U.S. is responsible for helping Ukraine approach. We saw Ron DeSantis take a little bit more of a dodging, middle-of-the-ground approach where he said, well, we should give Ukraine aid if other countries step up and help. You saw Vivek Ramaswamy take the more MAGA approach where he says, no, we should cut off Ukraine aid entirely. And so that really shows where the Republican Party is at in terms of this issue, which is a big issue for the 2024 election.
Rodney, how did you see some of the policy nuances that emerged in the conversation?
Well, outside of what Shelby just mentioned, there really weren't many policy discussions. You know, what we saw was Nikki Haley have her moment by chastising Vivek about his lack of foreign policy experience. And Vivek started the debate, I think, really strong, but then kind of became the court jester. And he wanted to interrupt everyone to get the attention on himself, rightfully so, because not many people knew who he was before that debate. And in the end, he ended up being the one that many candidates focused on to get their points across. Nikki Haley did the best job of standing right next to him and cornering him on the issue of foreign policy. And that's where Vivek is going to be weak coming into the future. I don't think this debate ended up helping him in the long run. If it would have ended about after 15 minutes, I think he would have come out the clear winner. But he surely didn't last night. You have strong candidates for the general election, I believe, like Ron DeSantis and Tim Scott. Ron started out very angry, angrier than I knew him as. But as the debate went on, I thought he got better. And Tim did not get enough time to show who he really was. Tim was somebody in this debate who didn't argue didn't jump in, didn't interrupt, because that's who Tim Scott is. And we'll see if it helps him or not. But this debate was anything but a true debate, and it's anything but an entertainment venue rather than a venue to where we can select a candidate who can take the Trump mantle away from him.
To what degree are these debates really job interviews for positions in a future Trump administration or contending for a VP slot?
Look, after watching the debate last night with Vice President Pence in it, I can't imagine any of them, let alone anyone, wanting to be Donald Trump's vice president. Look what it got Mike Pence. And I'll tell you, just from personal perspective, the many meetings I had with President Trump at the White House during his administration, I can count on one hand those that Mike Pence was not a part of. Mike Pence was the most loyal vice president that I've seen in my generation. And what did he get out of it? He basically got exiled by Donald Trump. And you saw him on stage trying to bring relevance to his presidential campaign again. I mean, when the question that is asked is, did Mike Pence do the right thing on January 6th? You kind of see where the Republican primary electorate is right now. I was with Mike Pence on January 6th. You damn right he did the right thing. That was the right thing for our Constitution and the country, and there should be no debate about it within the Republican primary or anywhere else for that matter.
But all of them except Asa Hutchinson, former governor of Arkansas, essentially said that they would be supportive of Donald Trump, even if convicted of serious federal crimes, and that they would still support Donald Trump in that case. And so it raises this interesting question, which I think conflicts a little bit with what you said, Shelby. How can both things be true? How can they both authentically, seriously want to be president of the United States and still be so obsequious to the last president who's facing so many federal indictments?
I think the simple answer is you look at the Republican base as a whole. And when I'm on the ground talking to voters, which, we've been to South Carolina, New Hampshire, Iowa, even the voters who are interested in a Trump alternative or flat out don't want Trump to be president again, at the same time don't want to vote for somebody who directly goes after the former president. And there's this kind of weird there's this weird situation going on with Republican voters where Trump has such a hold over them, where even if they don't want him to be president again, they are buying into the rhetoric he is telling them about these indictments being politically motivated, and if they're coming for me, they're actually coming for you next. And so it is this very fine line that Trump's opponents are having to walk, an almost impossible line where they're running against him, but they can't really come out against him.
Well, let me ask you a question. I'm going to show you both a poll here that we have. It's a pretty remarkable poll. It's a poll of Trump supporters, Trump voters. And the question is, if you were to ask who you trust most, who's telling you the truth? And of those people polled, 71% say Donald Trump, and that's 63% for friends and family. In other words, they trust Donald Trump more than friends and family, which is just remarkable. What are we, I'd like our audience to understand the tectonics of political view in a non-disparaging way. What's happening in the Republican Party and the Trump base? And is there any tension there that we should, that might be interesting to discuss?
Well, first off, Steve, that I represented a district that was a 50-50 district in Congress from Illinois for 10 years. The Democrats in Illinois redistricted a district that I now live in that made it a solid Trump Republican district. And Donald Trump is the reason I'm not in Congress anymore. I lost my primary because he endorsed my opponent. And I saw what your poll actually stated firsthand. My election, every poll we had us winning until Election Day when we didn't. And when you look at what Donald Trump did in my district, he came to an area that didn't know me, didn't know my opponent, and he was able to change the projected turnout model in substantial numbers to where I lost the race. So Donald Trump is believed by many in the Republican primary voter bloc. And it frustrates me because Donald Trump is somebody, as president and even after his presidency, he's not known for being directly honest on every issue. And that just goes beyond the Republican Party too, Steve. This goes to where we are in America as a culture right now, where people will go find their news on their social media sites that they already agree with and assume that there's no other viewpoint. We don't have debates, let alone primary debates for presidential nominations that go awry like last night. We don't even have debates between individuals that can actually talk to each other. And that, to me, is the long-term damaging effect of what we've seen in politics today. And it's not just relevant to the Republican Party. I can tell you that firsthand.
You know, Shelby, when you talk to the Trump team and the people around him, what are the things that you think might throw him off, that might get him in to make him think that he needs to go on stage with some of these contenders? Or is he so far ahead, so high in the heavens right now in the GOP, that that's just never going to happen? Because I'm interested in now, what's part 2, part 3, part 4, and will any of this be relevant to the choice that the Republican Party makes?
Yeah, it's funny you asked that because I was actually speaking to Trump's team last night in the spin room, which they were in, although Trump didn't participate in the debate. And I did ask, do you think he's going to do any of these debates, any of these primary debates? And I was told, don't bet on it, essentially. But at the same time, it's Trump. He's very unpredictable. He could just wake up tomorrow and decide that somebody said something and he feels like he needs to go on stage. But it seems unlikely at this point if the Republican primary polling-wise continues the way it goes. Now, the other interesting thing I also asked Trump's team was, well, doesn't this give Joe Biden an out if Trump does win the nomination in the general? And they kind of disagreed. They said they didn't think it gave him an out. But I've heard the argument that it absolutely would give Joe Biden an out in a general election debate.
Rodney, let me ask you about another poll. This one ran in the New York Times. It was a hypothetical standoff between Biden and Trump. And it's fascinating. They're tied neck and neck in the 43%, with 14% still out there waiting to choose. It's a close race when you kind of look at that, and it's much closer than I would have thought between these two very well-known entities. And I guess my question is, are there other Republicans out there that you see who might be able to clobber Biden and might be a better reflection of Republican conservatism from your perspective?
Every single candidate on that stage would beat Joe Biden. I mean, it's not surprising to me that many in the Beltway and many in some of our larger metropolitan areas are surprised by the fact that Donald Trump and Joe Biden are tied in that poll, let alone any poll. Because metropolitan cities of America despise Donald Trump. It's personal. They can't fathom anybody supporting him. But I live in an area in rural America that they can't understand why anybody would vote for Joe Biden. That's the disconnect. And we have a true polarization happening in America between not just our red and blue states, but between our rural and urban parts of America. And that unbelief in Donald Trump being a candidate who's tied with Joe Biden is a direct result of that polarization in the urban areas where many of us work or reside, like in Washington, D.C. And I was interested in hearing Shelby's comments on the debate. There's absolutely no way that Donald Trump debates any of these people. He can get any stage he wants at any time, and the media will immediately turn their head away like the character, the dog in the movie Up, when it's like a squirrel. They will look at Trump like squirrel, and they will figure out how to ask every elected Republican a question about Donald Trump, and not a single one for months about the other candidates that participated in that debate. And Donald Trump, he doesn't need to debate if he makes it, when he makes it to the general election, if you believe the polls right now, because I believe the only reason he lost the 2020 election because he had such a crappy performance in the first debate in September of that year.
Rod, you know, I was familiar with the many steps that you took after January 6th, and I want our audience to know that after January 6th, Congressman Rodney Davis was responsible in many ways for helping to shape the security environment, the interaction with the Capitol Police, a lot of the broad governance issues in the administration of the House of Representatives. And you dealt with a lot with law enforcement and all of those issues. I guess I'm interested in your personal reaction to the demonization of so many law enforcement institutions, the FBI, and really very strident talks about firing Chris Wray, the director of the FBI. Interested in how you feel, given how much you did after January 6th to try to heal a lot of that.
Well, first off, there's nobody who's a bigger supporter of law enforcement at all levels than I am. Look, I'm here, and my friends that play on the Republican congressional baseball team with me are still alive today because we saw brave, well-trained Capitol Police officers, David Bailey and Crystal Griner, run toward gunfire so we could run away from gunfire on a baseball field in Alexandria, Virginia, a few years ago. I love the Capitol Police. They saved my life. But that doesn't mean I'm not critical of the decisions that the management of the Capitol Police and the governing body called the Capitol Police Board pre and post January 6th that they made and have made. And frankly, I'm still disappointed in many of the security posture decisions that have been put in place in and around the Capitol complex because I don't think they've gone far enough yet. And the same thing can be said about the Department of Justice. I don't know Merrick Garland. I really haven't worked with him. I don't know Chris Wray. I haven't worked with him. But we do know that we had leaders in the FBI that spied on the Trump campaign in 2016, that created a hoax, the Russia hoax that I know and I believe truly was concocted by opposition research that the Hillary Clinton campaign paid for. And I do believe much of America truly thinks that there's a two-tiered system of justice, which is why every time Donald Trump gets indicted, his poll numbers goes up. They go up. Donald Trump is the best person at playing the victim, but let's not underestimate how rural America feels right now when it comes to our upper echelon of law enforcement, those who run those agencies.
Shelby, I'd love to get your take on, the discussion in the spin room and also on stage about the FBI director, about the kind of weaponization of the legal system, because this does seem to really strike a chord with a lot of Americans. But it raises then, I think, a fundamental question about citizens and their faith and trust in government, and what you have if you just have, it kind of begins to look like just two really very different worlds that have a hard time talking to each other. But I'm just interested in that legal institutional toxicity, if you will.
I think everything I've heard on the ground and on the debate stage from candidates, from Republican voters, is it's clear that trust in government is at an all-time low. And so I don't think, actually, I agree with Rodney here. I think that argument that we heard on stage about the politicization of the FBI and the DOJ, it's something that resonates with a lot of Republican voters and independent voters. And so it is kind of a winning argument right now within the Republican Party, aside from whether you or you personally believe it's true. It's how a lot of voters are feeling. And so it makes sense to me that Trump's opponents are taking his indictments and kind of leaning into that aspect of it, while at the same time not necessarily leaning into defending some of his actions with some of these particular indictments. They see a clear lane to push the belief that so many Republican voters feel across the country that this is a two-tiered system of justice.
Shelby, one of the things I was watching for last night was sort of the race for number two. And Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has been clearly number two. I don't know if that's still the case now. He advocated last night, day one of his presidential administration, gathering troops and deploying them inside Mexico to the border, which was a fairly provocative statement. I'm just interested in your gut feeling as you look at it. Who do you think is basically emerging around that number two now? And who do you think we will never see again on the debate stage?
I think Vivek is probably the one who's emerging as DeSantis's biggest potential opponent, just because, you saw on the debate stage last night, before DeSantis got on stage, the expectation was he was going to be the one who was attacked left and right, and it was Vivek. And I don't know if that was partially because he's rising in the polls. He's number 3 in most of the polls at this point, but also because he's a 38-year-old with no political experience. And so I think these other candidates on stage who are seasoned, you know, are a little bit like, hey, man, what are you doing here? This isn't an easy job. You know, you can't just come in here and say that you will do X, Y, Z. But I don't think this debate was bad for DeSantis. I heard the argument from his campaign afterwards that he stayed above the fray, he showed that he was the adult in the room, and that he came out strong, and that was why the other candidates didn't hit him. I don't know if I believe the last part, but I do believe that, you know, we'll see polls as to how voters felt like Republican candidates did. I think he'll be pretty high on that list. I think Hutchinson probably was on the lower end of the list just because he didn't seem to make a splash in any way whatsoever. I think Chris Christie did exactly what he came to do, which was throw some sledgehammers and throw some punches. I don't think it was necessarily a horrible debate for any one of the candidates, though.
Rod, let me ask you the same question. Be interested to see who you think we might not hear from again on the debate stage, and whether you think there are other folks we may have yet to see enter this race.
Those that won't be on the debate stage again, Asa Hutchinson, he'll be gone. Doug Burgum, he should be the next candidate that would go because he really is an unknown, but he has the personal resources to meet the requirements that might be that are forthcoming by the RNC. So you can't count him out. But in the end, Governor DeSantis, he won parts of the debate last night because he didn't take the bait. And I think he was smart to look around and realize everybody was looking at the clown show that became Vivek, and they attacked Vivek instead of him. That was a good thing because I think everybody thought after the DeSantis debate memo was leaked by his consultant that Ron was going to be structured on his talking points and go after Vivek. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to follow his polling memo. Maybe that was a genius move by his team to get everybody else to focus on Vivek because he was truly the one who was giving Ron the most heartburn before that event. Final
word to Shelby. Was Trump right not to show up?
Yeah, I think he had a point not to show up, as his team has said. And I'm purely speaking from if I was part of a Republican campaign, not from a personal perspective. He's up in the polls a lot. And so I see the argument that if he showed up, he would be legitimizing his opponents. For what reason? And I've even heard this argument made by Democrats that I've talked to in recent weeks who privately say, yeah, listen, it was smart for him not to show up. This is essentially a race for second.
Former Congressman Rodney Davis and journalist Shelby Talcott, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks.
So what's the bottom line? You might be wondering, why should anybody care about what's going on now in the Republican Party if the elections are late next year? Well, it's because presidential races are marathons. They're not sprints. What's happening now will definitely affect what happens next November. Besides the internal debates among Republicans, soon we'll have debates between Republicans and Democrats. Everybody's trying to persuade the American people that they have a plan for their future. Along the way, so many names and faces will rise, and those thinking they have an edge will slip, and those behind may gain. This was just the opening shot, and that's the bottom line.